Let's talk geopolitics in focus now. That former President Trump has tapped Senator JD Vance to be his running mate. Trump bringing aboard someone who has argued that the U.S. Should encourage Ukraine to strike a peace deal with Russia, and that Ukraine should also be prepared perhaps to cede some land to Russia. Join us now to talk about all this, as well as possible new tariffs, China, much more. Elbridge Colby, who served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Trump administration. Bridge, it's good to see you. President Trump himself, I think some people would characterize his global view as more isolationist than maybe what the current administration that we're seeing from the Biden administration. This seems like it's doubling down on at least that perception. And do you agree with it, Bridge?
Joe, great to be with you. I don't agree with that at all. I think the term isolationist applied to President Trump and Senator Vance is really inaccurate and generally a canard, in fact. I mean, look, I think, and I don't speak for President Trump or his campaign, but I think if you take an honest look at the situation and what they're saying, it's an America first foreign policy, which is to say they're going to put the practical interests of the American people first. If you look at the platform that President Trump, as I understand, had a pretty intimate involvement in formulating, it's very clear. It says it's going to be a common sense approach. It's going to focus on reindustrialization, on unleashing American energy, on securing the border, and on a strong military used sparingly. And what's ironic, frankly, is that sounds to me a lot like the doctrine on military use of military force under President Reagan, which was the Weinberger doctrine at the time, which was saying, hey, you know, we're not looking for a fight. I think Senator Vance said this last night with Sean Hannity. We're not looking for a fight, but if you pick one with us, we're gonna make sure we win. And it's also saying alliances are important, but that people have got to pull their weight. Joe, I think that's common sense. That's not isolationism. I'll tell you, that's the way that these alliances are actually going to survive. I think the way we're heading now, we're heading straight for the Titanic because President Biden and his team, they're great at making commitments and, you know, broad rhetorical pledges, but they don't back it up. I mean, the defense budget isn't even increasing under President Biden. Our defense industrial base is in terrible shape. So there's a yawning gap between rhetoric and reality that's really dangerous if our debts get called.
I guess there's quite a wedge, though, between the nominee, vice presidential nominee, and what a lot of people think about Ukraine, though, Bridge. I think he actually quoted as saying, "I don't care what happens to Ukraine. I care about what happens to you know." It's a populist approach almost, and the journal said, Wall Street Journal said, is exploding about the economic implications of JD Vance in terms of populism and not your father's GOP, all kinds of things like that. You don't see it that way you're comfortable with our standing in the world, maybe not being as, I just don't know if we'd be as involved in as many places as we are now under a Trump presidency. Is that okay to come off the world stage?
Well, that's necessary. If you want American leadership and strength to survive, we've got to reconcile the yawning gap between our commitments and what we're actually prepared to do, and the fact that our allies have, in many cases, disarmed. So I think President Trump and Senator Vance are both issuing a clarion call. I'd recommend to your attention Senator Vance's remarks at the Munich Security Conference earlier this year, his piece in the Financial Times, where he's, you know, laid out a very common sense agenda, which is that, you know, and consistent with what President Trump said in his Truth Social post a few months ago about the supplemental, which is that the Europeans are going to have to take primary responsibility for their own defense and the support for Ukraine that I think is consistent with an attempt to broker peace there. I'll say this, Joe, it's not consistent maybe with our father's Republican Party. I'll say the Republican Party over the last generation, both President Trump and Senator Vance have made this point, has not done very well in a lot of respects. Right. The old paladins of that Republican Party, they keep pointing back and I say, well, you got a couple failed wars and nation building campaigns. You had a financial crisis. You had an insecure border. I'd say this is a lot of going back to maybe our grandfather's Republican Party, much more consistent with as President Reagan actually governed. Didn't use the military very sparingly, concentrate on the decisive theater. President Nixon, President Eisenhower, you know, a lot of the critics of President Trump and Senator Vance like to wrap themselves in the mantle of the Cold War. During the Cold War, people were really serious about what we could actually substantiate. President Eisenhower was very attuned to the economic costs of a Cold War competition. So I actually think, frankly, if you want this American-led international system to survive, you've got to follow the kind of agenda that President Trump and Senator Vance are talking about.
the fear and loathing in some of our European allies and about NATO, and supposedly they're very concerned about the outcome of the election. Maybe they do have a horse in the game. They're finally starting to put a little more into NATO, but that's a recent development.
Well, I think they're going through the stages of grief. They're actually moving in the right direction. I would suggest that and many Europeans are now increasingly recognizing this, they should stop wringing their hands about American domestic politics, which frankly is our affair, and get down to business, which a number of them are, including members on the center left of European governments, like the Minister of Defense in Germany, Boris Pistorius, or the new Labour government in the United Kingdom. These people understand what's up, and they understand the direction of travel in the United States. So again, there's a huge yawning gap. I mean, President Biden, again, will talk. I mean, I think he's really good at talking, but the backup is not there. And I think it's just common sense for American foreign policy to be practical. There's a real difference where President Biden will talk about it in this kind of sacred, very fluffy kind of way. But you know who's going to pay the bills for that is American people. And I think what Senator Vance and President Trump, they're saying is, look, this has got to work for Americans. They're open-minded. I think the platform was very clear about that. But, that it's got to be practical and common sense. Well,
Bridge, and you've opined a lot on China, Taiwan, and the like. What would a Trump-Vance administration, how would they view a move on Taiwan by China? How should they view it? What should be done? What should be done to engage China now or to confront China now?
Look, I can't speak for President Trump and the campaign, but what I would say is I think what I see as the best policy, and I think this is consistent with what they've both been saying, is that we need to be strong, but we also need to be measured. I know President Trump has kind of stuck to the traditional policy of strategic ambiguity over Taiwan. He's expressed openness to discussions with Xi Jinping. At the same time, the platform has talked about countering China. Senator Vance has talked a lot about the importance of prioritizing our scarce military resources. The platform talks about reindustrialization, revitalization of our defense industrial base. I think this idea of being in a position of strength to avoid World War III, which I think is a very serious risk. I mean, don't take it from me. The Secretary of the Air Force under Biden, Frank Kendall, has said the Chinese are preparing for war. So in that kind of situation, again, this goes back to President Reagan's approach, which is peace through strength, which is the strength part people emphasize a lot, and that's absolutely right, and husbanding and revitalizing our defense industrial base and our military resources, but also the openness to a modus vivendi with China to avoid a war if that's at all possible, because nobody wants that. I certainly don't want that for Americans.